Queen Charlotte time to spend in the Bridgerton franchise seems to be running out, and there is a big reason why. However, what really could happen to her next in season 4 and how it plays out will all be explained in this video. In the spin-off series Queen Charlotte, the queen was always anxious anytime she had an emergency call by asking if the king had passed away, although many people don't understand why the queen was always asking that question. As the spin-off series revealed to us, King George and Queen Charlotte had a very fiery romance that was also painful and torturous due to the king's mental illness. And as the queen, the weight of running the society fell on her with the increasing absence of her husband. So for many years, there was no marriage for her to enjoy because her husband was simply not there, which means she has continuously mourned his loss many times. And with that, she became obsessed with the news of his demise, so her mourning could finally make sense. However, Queen Charlotte might not need to worry much about that now, as season 3 has foreshadowed she might be the one who gets to be mourned soon after all. During the debuting scene in season 3, she became so bored that she made a shocking statement to Brimsley, who asked if she would need any refreshments.
Shall I fetch your refreshment, Your Majesty?
Perhaps a casket. The lack of interest here today shall usher me to an early grave at any moment.
Although it sounded like sarcasm, Queen Charlotte might be hinting that she would pass away earlier than expected. Firstly, the character of Queen Charlotte isn't in the Bridgerton books except for the latest one, which the spin-off series is based on. So this makes the timeline messed up a bit because Queen Charlotte is based on the real Queen Charlotte from the 1800s. Although she isn't in the books, her story in the show strictly follows how the historical Queen Charlotte lived her life, meaning we could probably predict what will happen next, which makes it scary to think of what could occur to the queen in the series. An example of how the series follows the historical accuracy of the real Queen Charlotte is that just like we saw in Queen Charlotte, the young Mozart played in her palace while the other ladies in her court applauded the young talent. Mozart was 8 years old at the time when he visited London while on a grand tour to Europe, and he ended up playing for the Queen a few times in 1764. In Queen Charlotte, it was mentioned that the Queen enjoyed listening to the young Mozart play, and she was pretty young at the time, which is exactly similar to how it happened in history. Despite the King's illness, the Queen ended up having many children up to 15, and it was also a historically accurate portrayal of what happened. According to historians, the Queen and King were really in love with each other, as we saw in the show, and the king was entirely devoted to her and never had a mistress, which was pretty common for royalties at the time. Instead of finding pleasures outside of his marriage, the king loved spending time with Queen Charlotte, talking about many interesting topics concerning music and books. Also, the historical King George had a mental illness that worsened over the years, which the doctor who treated him at the time did not know much about. There was no cure or proper diagnosis too, and he was continually tortured as a form of treatment by using leeches on his skin, whipping him, and injecting him with harsh substances, just like we saw in the show. So if the Bridgerton franchise followed many of the important details in the life of the Queen, then it definitely would mean that the Queen passing away is a huge part of her story that's going to happen anytime too. And here is why. In history, Queen Charlotte passed away in 1818. Season 3 of Bridgerton is set around 1815 to 1816, judging from the book Emma that Eloise was reading. Emma was published on December 23rd, 1815, and the Bridgerton series started in the spring through summer, which means it's halfway through 1816, and there's less than 3 years before Queen Charlotte becomes deceased. The crazy thing is the Queen already foreshadowed an early grave for herself, which means it might happen sooner than expected. However, what makes this even more complicated is that the age of Queen Charlotte in the show isn't the same as the real Queen Charlotte's age around the same year. In the Bridgerton franchise, Queen Charlotte is still 52 years old in 1815, which is after season 2. Her husband, King George, is around 57 or 58, which means they are both still young and far from the ages at which they both passed. The real Queen Charlotte, who passed away in 1818, was 74 years old when it happened, and that should be a sort of good news since it means that the on-screen Queen Charlotte is still very far from that age and might have many more years to live in the Bridgerton franchise. Funnily enough, if Bridgerton 3 is set in 1816, that means there are about 2 years left for the Queen. However, if Bridgerton slows it down to follow the age, that could also mean Queen Charlotte could still live more than a decade, which is very good news for the fans and lovers of the character. But sadly, since there's so much age difference between the historical one and the on-screen one, Bridgerton may have used that scene where the Queen spoke about going to an early grave as a hint that she would become deceased younger than her historical version. And this hint isn't new because it's the biggest tragedy that Bridgerton has been teasing for a long while, especially with how Queen Charlotte was always asking if the king was gone. So this sad event that could happen in Bridgerton 4 is a big one that will show us how King George will outlive Queen Charlotte, which will be a crazy spin on their story and the challenges they've been through together. From the early years of their marriage, the Queen never got to enjoy much as the marriage was left unconsummated for a long time before it finally happened, and they got to enjoy some moments of marital bliss together. Then subsequently, the illness took over, and the only time Queen Charlotte got to feel or spend time with King George was whenever he was sane. So throughout their marriage, Queen Charlotte was affected by her husband's illnesses. To make up for the sad, lonely moments, she became consumed by society events, matchmaking, and trying to find the perfect romantic courtship in the ton, which were like her coping mechanism. So that's why the Queen became famous for interfering with courtships and even getting to have her pick of the diamond of the season. Since her early marriage had limited fun, she tried to make up for it by involving herself with the young debutantes of the season. And in season 3, we saw that the Queen was already becoming bored of the events. Of course, she was still very much interested, but wasn't getting the desired effects. She wanted to, but she wasn't as enthusiastic as she used to be. So she continued yawning, sighing, and refusing to pick the diamond of the season despite the ton's apprehension. So when she mentioned that the events she used to enjoy could send her to an early grave, it was a point made to show that there was nothing much left for Queen Charlotte to love again. Before then, she usually asked questions to know if the king was still alive so that she could finally be free and get to know that she had lost King George fully rather than losing him on most days and getting him back for a few moments. And suppose this big tragedy befalls Queen Charlotte in season 4. In that case, it will further prove that she lived a sorrowful life in the shadow of her husband's illness, and the only things that gave her joy were the memories and being able to see bright and beautiful debutantes every season. Queen Charlotte's demise isn't a theory, especially since she's based on a real-life person. However, the timeline of the series is one thing that can be confusing, and another way to figure that out is with the birth of her grandchild, Queen Victoria. In Queen Charlotte, we saw how the Queen was constantly disturbing her children to produce an heir for the throne, and at the end of the show, Prince Edward told her his wife was pregnant with a daughter. According to historical reports, the expected daughter is Queen Victoria, which makes Queen Charlotte's demise closer than expected. Queen Victoria was born in May 1819, and Queen Charlotte already passed in December 1818. Since her mother is already pregnant in Queen Charlotte, it means the baby will soon arrive, which makes it more certain that Queen Charlotte's story might come to an end pretty soon. But what makes her story even sadder is that even though she's been the one expecting the news of King George's passing, when she became deceased before the king, they never told him about it due to his mental condition. As someone who was constantly in and out of a mental slump, King George never knew about Queen Charlotte's demise till he passed away, which is so tragic considering how much they loved each other. However, fans still have enough time to see more of Queen Charlotte on the screen in season 3 as she gets to name the Emerald of the Season. Also, many people would be wondering how Queen Charlotte will pass away, seeing as she's still very healthy in Bridgerton 3. The historic royal palaces published that the real-life Queen Charlotte died as a result of pneumonia, which could be the exact way the fictional character would pass away too, so that means the Queen might not be available to see all of the Bridgerton siblings get married. Despite the tragedy that could happen to Queen Charlotte in Bridgerton 4, heartbroken fans could hold on to the disclaimer made by the show Queen Charlotte, a Bridgerton story where it says it's not a history lesson, it's fiction inspired by fact. Although Bridgerton has constantly claimed not to follow historical accuracy, viewers should know that whatever happens to Queen Charlotte in season 4 will still end up being a surprise. And that's because she's a beloved character whose sorrowful life has made way for so many love matches in the show.